Dad, call the police. Millionaire is surprised by his daughter on his birthday. But 15 minutes later, something happens. The mansion of Robert Montgomery shone with unusual splendor that night. The crystal lights reflected glimmers on the elegantly dressed guests, while champagne flowed and laughter filled the air. It was Robert's 45th birthday, but more importantly, it was the night he would officially introduce Caroline Vaughan as his girlfriend to his inner circle. Robert, a businessman respected throughout New York for his integrity and vision, felt on top of the world. At 45, he believed he had finally found true love in Caroline, a beautiful and intelligent woman who had entered his life like a whirlwind 6 months ago. Caroline, in her red dress that accentuated every curve of her body, moved gracefully among the guests. Her dazzling smile and natural charisma captivated everyone who spoke to her. Robert couldn't take his eyes off her, feeling like the luckiest man in the world. In a corner of the room, Sophie, Robert's 10-year-old daughter, observed the scene with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Dressed in a pretty blue dress, the girl seemed out of place among so many adults. Her eyes followed Caroline's every move, a look of concern clouding her childish face. Robert approached the center of the room, his champagne glass held high. The murmur of conversations faded as all eyes turned to him. "Dear friends and family," Robert began, his voice resonating with joy and pride. "Thank you for joining me on this special night. Not only are we celebrating my birthday, but I also have an important announcement to make." Caroline approached him, her radiant smile as she took his hand. Robert looked at her with adoration before continuing. "I am pleased to officially introduce you to the woman who has brightened my life in recent months. Caroline Vaughan, my..." "Dad, call the police." Sophie's high-pitched voice cut through the air like a knife. Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. All eyes turned to the girl, who was now standing next to her father, her small hand gripping the sleeve of his jacket. Robert, stunned, looked at his daughter. "Sophie, what are you saying?" The girl pointed at Caroline with a trembling finger. "She's not who you think she is, Dad. You have to call the police." Caroline, who until that moment had maintained her perfect smile, visibly paled. Her eyes moved quickly between Robert and Sophie, a shadow of fear crossing her face for an instant. The guests began to murmur, the festive atmosphere evaporating in seconds. Robert, always the composed host, tried to maintain calm. "Sophie, honey, why don't we go talk in private?" he said, trying to guide his daughter out of the room. But Sophie stood firm. "No, Dad, everyone needs to know the truth about her." Caroline stepped forward, her voice shaky but controlled. "Robert, I don't know what's going on, but there must be some misunderstanding." Robert's eyes moved between his daughter and the woman he loved, his mind struggling to comprehend the situation. The silence in the room was deafening, the tension palpable. At that moment, the door to the room burst open. An unknown man, dressed in black, rushed in. His eyes fixed on Caroline, a look of urgency on his face. "Caroline, we have to go now!" Chaos erupted in the room. Guests began to murmur louder, some even screaming. Robert, stunned, watched as Caroline looked at the newcomer with a mixture of fear and recognition. "Who are you?" Robert demanded, his voice broken by the confusion and betrayal he was beginning to feel. The man ignored Robert, approaching Caroline and taking her by the arm. "There's no time for explanations. We have to get out of here." Caroline looked at Robert, her eyes full of tears. "I'm sorry, Robert. I never meant for things to be like this." Before Robert could react, Caroline and the mysterious man headed for the exit. The guests, in shock, stepped aside to let them pass. Robert, paralyzed by shock, could only watch as the woman he loved disappeared through the door, taking with her all his hopes and dreams. Sophie clung to her father, tears running down her cheeks. The birthday party, which was supposed to be a night of celebration and love, had become the beginning of a mystery that threatened to destroy everything Robert thought he knew about his life and his heart. The days following the disastrous birthday party were a whirlwind of confusion and pain for Robert. The mansion, once filled with laughter and expectations, now seemed like a mausoleum of broken dreams. Robert locked himself in his study, ignoring calls from concerned friends and business associates. Sophie, for her part, struggled between guilt for ruining her father's party and the certainty that she had done the right thing. The girl spent hours sitting in front of the door of Robert's study, waiting for the moment when he would be ready to listen to what she knew. It was on the third day when Robert finally emerged from his self-imposed isolation. With pronounced dark circles and a haggard face, he sat next to his daughter on the sofa in the main living room. "Sophie," he began, his voice hoarse from disuse, "I need you to tell me everything you know about Caroline." The girl took a deep breath before beginning her story. "A week ago, Dad, I saw Caroline talking to a man in the garden. It wasn't the same man from the party. It was someone different. They were arguing, and I heard Caroline say something about ending everything in relation to you." Robert felt his heart sink even further. "Why didn't you tell me before, honey?" "I was scared, Dad," Sophie replied, tears threatening to fall. "And I wanted to be sure. But when I saw how she looked at you at the party, I knew I had to do something." Robert hugged his daughter, grateful for her bravery and at the same time tormented by the implications of her revelation. Who was Caroline really? And what did end everything mean? Determined to discover the truth, Robert hired a private investigator. Days turned into weeks as he waited for answers. Each night, he obsessively reviewed every moment he had spent with Caroline, looking for signs he might have missed. It was a month after the party when the investigator arrived with a thick file. Robert opened it with trembling hands, and what he found inside left him cold. Caroline Vaughn was not who she claimed to be. Her real name was Elena Suarez, and she had a history of scamming wealthy men in several Latin American countries. Photographs, police reports, and testimonies from previous victims painted the picture of a ruthless woman who did not hesitate to manipulate and deceive to get what she wanted. Robert felt sick. Every sweet moment, every whispered promise, every plan for the future, it had all been a lie. The woman he thought he loved didn't exist. But there was more. The investigator had discovered connections between Caroline, Elena, and a known criminal group dedicated to money laundering. The implications were clear. Robert had not only been the target of a romantic scam, but he could also have been used as a pawn in a much larger criminal scheme. As he processed this devastating information, Robert couldn't help but think of his late wife, Sophie's mother. What would she think of all this? How had he been so blind, so naive? But in the midst of his pain and confusion, a new determination began to emerge in Robert. Not just for himself, but for Sophie and for the memory of his wife. He had to get to the bottom of this. He had to discover the complete truth, no matter how painful it might be. With the file in hand, Robert made a decision. He could no longer trust just his heart. He would have to use all his cunning and resources to unravel this web of lies. And if Caroline Elena thought she could simply disappear after shattering his life, she was very wrong. The hunt had begun, and Robert Montgomery, the man who had always valued honesty above all else, was about to enter a world of deception and betrayal from which he might never fully escape. While Robert immersed himself in his personal investigation, unbeknownst to him, he was being watched. In a small apartment across town, Caroline, or rather Special Agent Elena Suarez, nervously reviewed surveillance reports on the Montgomery mansion. Elena had spent the last 3 years of her life working on a high-level undercover operation. Her mission, to infiltrate the upper echelons of New York society, to dismantle a money laundering network that extended throughout Latin America. Robert Montgomery, although he didn't know it, was connected to this network through several of his business associates. The night of the birthday party had been a calculated disaster. Elena never expected little Sophie to discover her, and the appearance of her contact, Agent Javier Ramirez, had been an emergency measure to extract her before her cover was completely compromised. Now sitting in her modest apartment, Elena struggled between her duty as an agent and the genuine feelings she had developed for Robert. Never in her years of service had she experienced such a profound conflict between her mission and her heart. "You should forget about him," said Javier, entering the room with 2 cups of coffee. "Montgomery is just another target, another pawn in this game." Elena took the cup but didn't drink. "It's not that simple, Javier. Robert is different. He really doesn't know anything about the criminal network. He's an honest man caught in a web of lies." Javier sighed, sitting across from her. "That's what they always say, Elena. Remember why we're here. Think about all the lives that have been ruined by this money laundering network. We can't afford sentimentality now." Elena knew Javier was right, But she couldn't get the image of Robert out of her mind, his face full of confusion and pain at the party. And then there was Sophie, that bright and perceptive girl who had seen through her facade. "There's something else," Eleanor said, putting the cup on the table. "I think Sophie discovered something important, something related to her mother's death." Javier leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What do you mean?" "The night before the party, I heard Sophie talking to her nanny. She mentioned a letter she found among her deceased mother's things. A letter that suggested her death was not an accident." Javier cursed under his breath. "This complicates things. If there's a connection between Mrs. Montgomery's death and our investigation—" "Exactly," Elena nodded. "We can't simply abandon this operation. There's too much at stake." A heavy silence fell in the room as both agents considered the implications of this new information. Finally, Elena stood up, a new determination shining in her eyes. "I have to go back, Javier. I have to find a way to approach Robert again, to earn his trust, not just for the mission, but for him and for Sophie. They deserve to know the truth." Javier looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You know it's dangerous. If they discover you—" "It's a risk I have to take," Elena interrupted. "I've spent too much time building this life, this identity. I can't simply abandon it now, not when we're so close to the truth." Javier nodded slowly, recognizing the determination in his partner's voice. "Okay, but we're going to need a plan. We can't just have Caroline reappear without a convincing explanation." Elena smiled, a spark of her old wit shining in her eyes. "Leave it to me. I think I have an idea that might work." As the two agents began to plot their new plan, Elena couldn't help but think of Robert and Sophie. The guilt for having deceived them weighed on her, but she also felt a renewed resolution. This time, she promised herself, there would be no more lies. She would find a way to protect them and complete her mission, no matter the personal cost. What Elena didn't know was that her actions were about to trigger a series of events that would shake the foundations of New York society and test not only her loyalty as an agent, but also her own personal loyalty. 2 weeks after the conversation between Elena and Javier, Robert found himself in his office, reviewing financial documents with tired eyes. The investigation into Caroline and her possible criminal connections had led him to meticulously examine every aspect of his businesses, looking for any irregularity he might have overlooked. Suddenly, his assistant rushed in. "Mr. Montgomery, there's someone here to see you. They say it's urgent." Robert frowned. He wasn't expecting visitors. "Who is it?" Before the assistant could answer, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Robert stood up abruptly, his heart pounding. "Caroline," he whispered, incredulous. There she was, as beautiful as he remembered, but with an expression of determination he had never seen on her face before. "Robert," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I know you must hate me, but I need you to listen to me. Your life and Sophie's could be in danger." Robert struggled between anger, confusion, and a spark of hope he couldn't completely extinguish. "Why should I believe a word you say? You lied to me, you deceived us all." Caroline, or Elena as he now knew she was called, stepped forward. "You're right. I lied to you about who I am, but not about how I feel about you. Robert, I'm an undercover agent. I've been working to dismantle a money laundering network, and your business associates are involved." Robert sank into his chair, stunned by the revelation. "What? That's impossible. I've known these people for years." Eleanor pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the desk. "Here's the evidence. Suspicious transactions, secret meetings, it's all documented. Robert, I swear I came here intending to investigate you, but I really fell in love, and now I can't bear the thought of you or Sophie getting hurt because of this." Robert flipped through the documents, his mind spinning with each new revelation. Names of respected associates appeared linked to illegal activities. Astronomical figures moved through offshore accounts. It was undeniable. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, looking up at her. Eleanor took a deep breath. "Because we discovered something else, something related to your wife's death." Robert turned pale. "What does Maria have to do with all this?" "We believe she may have discovered something about this criminal network just before her accident," Elena explained softly. "And there are indications that her death may not have been an accident after all." Robert's world tilted. The idea that Maria's death could be connected to all this was too much to take in. He stood up and walked to the window, needing a moment to process all this information. "Robert," Elena said, approaching him, "I know I have no right to ask you anything, but I need your help. Together we can get to the bottom of this. We can do justice for Maria and protect Sophie." Robert turned to her, his eyes full of a mixture of emotions. "How do I know this isn't another lie? How can I trust you after everything that's happened?" Eleanor looked him directly in the eyes. "I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to look at the evidence, to investigate on your own if necessary. And if after that you still believe I'm lying, I'll hand over all the information to the authorities and disappear from your life forever." There was a long moment of silence as Robert considered his options. Finally he spoke. "If what you're saying is true, if Maria was murdered, I need to know. For Sophie, for myself. But this doesn't mean I forgive you or trust you completely." Elena nodded, relieved but aware that the road ahead would be difficult. "I understand. And I promise you that this time there will be no more secrets between us." As Robert and Eleanor began to discuss the details of what they knew and what they needed to find out, neither of them realized that Sophie, who had come to visit her father at the office, was listening to the entire conversation from the hallway, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. The girl quietly moved away, her mind working at full speed. She had information that could change everything, but who could she trust with her secrets now? Sophie snuck away from her father's office, her heart pounding. The conversation she had just overheard confirmed her worst fears and at the same time raised new questions. With silent steps, she headed to her room, closing the door behind her. Once alone, Sophie approached her desk and opened the secret drawer she had built with the help of her nanny, Lucy. From there, she took out a worn shoebox full of memories of her mother. With trembling hands, she extracted a crumpled letter from the bottom of the box. The letter, written by her mother Maria shortly before her death, was addressed to a name Sophie didn't recognize: Dear Alexander. In it, Maria expressed her concern about certain suspicious activities she had noticed in Robert's companies. She mentioned names and figures that Sophie didn't fully understand, but which now, after hearing Caroline, or Elena, as she apparently was called, began to take on a new and sinister meaning. Sophie sat on her bed, hugging the letter to her chest. Should she show this to her father, or to Caroline? And who was this Alexander? A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Sophie, honey, are you there?" It was Lucy's voice, her nanny. "Come in, Lucy," Sophie responded, quickly hiding the letter under her pillow. Lucy entered, her face showing concern. "I saw you running down the hallway. Is everything okay?" Sophie hesitated. Lucy had been like a second mother to her since Maria's death and had always been her confidant. But this was different. "Lucy," Sophie began, carefully choosing her words. "You knew my mom well, right?" Lucy sat next to Sophie, putting a comforting arm around her shoulders. "Of course, honey. Your mother and I were very close." Sophie took a deep breath. "Did she ever mention someone named Alexander to you?" Lucy visibly tensed, and Sophie couldn't help but notice. "Alexander? No, I don't remember that name." "Why do you ask?" The girl studied Lucy's face, noticing the slight tremor in her voice. For the first time, Sophie wondered if she could fully trust her nanny. Just curiosity," Sophie lied. "I heard that name somewhere and wondered if he was a friend of Mum's." Lucy forced a smile. "Well, your mother had many friends. Maybe he was one of them. But now, how about we go downstairs for a snack? I made your favorite cookies." Sophie nodded, allowing Lucy to guide her out of the room, but her mind was far from cookies. Now she was certain that Lucy knew more than she was saying, and this only added another layer of mystery to the situation. Meanwhile, in Robert's office, the conversation between him and Elena continued. "How can we be sure that no one else is involved?" asked Robert, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Elena looked at him seriously. "We can't. That's why we must be extremely careful. We don't know how far this network extends or who else might be implicated." Robert nodded, his mind working at full speed. "We need a plan. We can't just accuse my partners without concrete evidence." "I agree," said Elena. "I propose that we work together to gather more evidence. I have my resources as an agent, and you have direct access to the company's operations. Between the two of us, we can uncover the truth." Robert looked at her, still struggling with his conflicting feelings towards her. "And what about Sophie? How do we keep her safe in the midst of all this?" Elena moved closer, placing a gentle hand on Robert's arm. "We'll protect her, I promise you that. In fact, I think we should include her in this, to a certain extent. She's a smart and observant girl. She might have noticed things that we overlooked." Robert considered the idea for a moment. "Maybe you're right, but I don't want to expose her to any danger." "Of course not," Elena nodded. "We'll be careful. But Robert, there's something else you should know. The night before the party, I heard Sophie mention something about a letter she found among Maria's things, a letter that could be related to all of this." Robert's eyes widened in surprise. "A letter? Why didn't Sophie tell me about this?" "She was probably scared or confused," Eleanor suggested. "We should talk to her together. Show her that she can trust us." Robert nodded slowly. "All right. We'll talk to her tonight, after dinner. But Eleanor, I warn you. If I find out you're deceiving me again, if this is some kind of trick—" Eleanor interrupted him, taking his hand. "It's not, Robert. This time, I'm being completely honest with you. We're in this together." As Robert and Elena planned their next move and Sophie kept her secrets, none of them were aware that they were being watched. In a car parked across from the mansion, a man was taking photographs with a long-range camera, his face hidden by the shadow of a cap. The man took out his phone and dialed a number. "Sir, we have a problem. The agent has made contact with Montgomery again. It seems they're cooperating." A cold voice answered on the other end of the line. "Keep them under surveillance. If necessary, we'll take more drastic measures." The trap was set to close, and the players unknowingly were moving exactly as the mysterious Sir had anticipated. The truth was about to come to light, but the price could be higher than any of them imagined. The tension was palpable in the dining room of the Montgomery mansion that night. Robert, Eleanor, and Sophie were seated around the table, each lost in their own thoughts and secrets. Lucy moved silently, serving dinner and casting worried glances towards Sophie. Robert broke the silence, clearing his throat. "Sophie, honey, there's something important we need to talk to you about." Sophie looked up from her plate, her eyes moving between her father and Elena. "Is it about Caroline, or should I call her Elena?" Elena and Robert exchanged surprised looks. "How?" Elena began. "I heard you talking in the office," Sophie admitted. "I know you're an undercover agent, and that you believe Mom's death wasn't an accident." Robert closed his eyes for a moment, processing the information. "Sophie, you shouldn't have been eavesdropping. But since you know, we need you to tell us everything you know, especially about that letter you found." Sophie visibly tensed, and Lucy, who was filling a glass of water, almost spilled it. I don't know what you're talking about, Dad," Sophie lied, avoiding eye contact. Elena leaned forward. "Sophie, I know it's hard to trust me after everything that's happened, but I promise you we're on your side. If you know something that can help us uncover the truth about your mother, please tell us." Sophie looked at Lucy, who had frozen in a corner of the dining room. The nanny gave her an almost imperceptible nod. With a sigh, Sophie took the crumpled letter from her pocket and placed it on the table. "I found it a few weeks ago, hidden in one of Mum's books." Robert took the letter with trembling hands and began to read it aloud. As Maria's words filled the room, everyone's faces reflected a mixture of shock and sadness. The letter revealed that Maria had discovered irregularities in the accounts of some of Robert's associated companies. It mentioned names of business partners and amounts of money that didn't add up. But the most shocking part was the last line. "Alexander, I fear for my life. If anything happens to me, make sure Robert and Sophie are safe." When Robert finished reading, the silence in the room was deafening. Elena was the first to speak. "Robert, this confirms our suspicions," Elena said softly. "Maria discovered something big, something that possibly cost her her life." Robert was pale, his hands still clutching the letter. "Who is this Alexander? And why didn't Maria come to me with this information?" Sophie, with tears in her eyes, looked at Lucy. "Lucy, you know something, don't you? Please tell us the truth." All eyes turned to the nanny, who seemed to be struggling with an internal decision. Finally, with a deep sigh, Lucy spoke. "Alexander is my brother," she confessed. He was a private detective and a close friend of Mrs. Maria. She went to him when she started suspecting illegal activities in the companies. Robert stood up abruptly. "What? You knew all this time and didn't say anything?" Lucy, with tears in her eyes, continued, "Maria made me promise to keep the secret. She wanted to protect you and Sophie. Alexander was investigating in secret, trying to gather concrete evidence before going to the authorities." Elena intervened. "Where is Alexander now? We need to talk to him urgently." Lucy's face darkened even more. "He disappeared shortly after Maria's death. I feared the worst, but a few weeks ago I received a cryptic message from him. I believe he's still alive and in hiding." Robert ran a hand over his face, trying to assimilate all this new information. "I can't believe Maria didn't trust me enough to tell me about this." "She did trust you, Robert," Lucy said softly. "But she also feared that if she involved you directly, you would be put in danger. She wanted to protect you." Sophie, who had been listening to everything with wide eyes, suddenly stood up from her chair. "Wait, there's something else." She ran out of the dining room and returned moments later with the shoebox. "I found this hidden at the bottom. I didn't understand what it was, but now I think it could be important." Inside the box was a USB drive. Elena took it carefully. "This could contain the evidence that Maria and Alexander collected. We need to review it immediately, but with caution. If it contains what I think it does, it could be very dangerous." Robert nodded, his face showing renewed determination. "We'll do it together. But first, Lucy, I need you to tell me everything you know about Maria and Alexander's investigation. Every detail could be crucial." As Lucy began to recount everything she knew, Elena noticed a movement out of the corner of her eye. Through the dining room window, she saw a shadow move quickly in the garden. "Everyone down!" Elena shouted, just as the sound of breaking glass filled the room. A bullet whizzed over their heads, embedding itself in the opposite wall. Robert acted quickly, turning off the lights and dragging Sophie under the table. Eleanor pulled a gun from her ankle holster, surprising everyone. "Lucy, take Sophie to the panic room," Robert ordered. "Eleanor and I will handle this." As Lucy and Sophie scurried away to the safety of the hidden panic room in the mansion, Robert and Eleanor prepared to face the unknown intruders who were clearly willing to silence them at any cost. "Robert," Eleanor whispered, "whatever happens, remember that we're in this together. Trust me." Robert looked into her eyes, seeing in them not the woman who had deceived him, but an ally he could trust with his life. With a nod, they prepared to defend not only their lives, but also the truth that had remained hidden for so long. The night that had begun as a family dinner had turned into a battle for survival, and the revelations that had come to light were only the beginning of a dangerous game of cat and mouse that was about to begin. The silence that followed the gunshot was deafening. Robert and Elena remained crouched behind the living room sofa, their breaths held as they strained their ears to detect any movement. "Do you think they're gone?" Robert whispered. Eleanor shook her head. "No, this was just a warning. They want us to know they have us in their sights." As if confirming her words, a voice resonated from outside the mansion. "Montgomery, we know you have the information. Hand it over to us and maybe we'll consider letting you live." Robert and Elena exchanged looks. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We need to buy time," Elena responded. "Sophie and Lucy are safe in the panic room, but we need to get to that USB drive and find out what it contains." Robert nodded. "The study. I have a hidden safe behind a painting. We can store the USB there and access it from my computer." "Good thinking," said Elena. "I'll distract them while you sneak to the study." Before Robert could protest, Eleanor moved towards the window and shouted, "We have the mansion surrounded by agents. You're making a grave mistake." As the attackers responded with a new round of gunfire, Robert took advantage of the distraction to crawl towards the hallway leading to the study. In the panic room, Sophie and Lucy listened to the sounds of the confrontation with terror. "Lucy, do you think Dad and Eleanor will be okay?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Lucy hugged the girl. "Your father is a smart and strong man, and Eleanor is a trained agent. They'll be fine." But even as she said these words, Lucy couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. There were so many things she still hadn't told them. Meanwhile, in the study, Robert had managed to access the safe and was inserting the USB drive into his computer. His eyes widened in astonishment as he saw the files it contained. "My God," he murmured. "Maria, what had you gotten into?" The documents revealed an intricate network of corruption involving several of his closest associates, high-ranking politicians, and even judges. Money laundering was just the tip of the iceberg. Suddenly, the study door burst open. Robert turned, expecting to see Elena, but instead found himself face to face with a man he had never seen before. "So here you are, Montgomery," the intruder said, pointing a gun at him. "Hand over that USB drive." Robert slowly raised his hands. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The man smiled coldly. "Let's say I'm a cleaner. I take care of problems like you and your wife." Robert's heart stopped for a moment. "How so you killed Maria?" "She was getting too close to the truth," the man responded without a hint of remorse. "Just like you are now." Just when it seemed all was lost, there was a loud thud, and the intruder fell to the floor, unconscious. Behind him stood Elena, holding a heavy candlestick. "Are you okay?" she asked, rushing to Robert. He nodded, still in shock. "Eleanor, the files? They reveal everything. It's worse than we imagined." Before they could discuss further, they heard sirens approaching. The police had finally arrived. The following hours were a whirlwind of activity. The police secured the mansion, arrested the intruders, and took statements. Robert insisted that Elena be recognized as an undercover agent, thus preventing her from being detained. When they could finally breathe, Robert, Elena, Sophie, and Lucy gathered in the living room, exhausted but relieved. "What happens now?" Sophie asked, clinging to her father's hand. Robert looked at Elena. "We have the evidence. We can expose the entire corruption network." But it will be dangerous," Elena completed. "Many powerful people will fall." Lucy, who had remained silent until that moment, spoke. "There's something else you should know." Everyone looked at her expectantly. "Alexander is alive, and he's here in the city." The revelation fell like a bomb. Robert jumped to his feet. "What? Where is he? Why hasn't he contacted us?" Lucy pulled a cell phone from her pocket. "He contacted me a few hours ago when all this started. He's willing to meet with us, but he has conditions." Elena took the phone. "Tell him we accept. We need all the help we can get." As Lucy made the call, Robert looked at Elena and Sophie. "This isn't over yet. In fact, I think it's just beginning." Elena nodded, taking Robert's hand. "But this time we're in this together, all of us." Sophie, looking at the adults around her, felt a mixture of fear and determination. "We're going to uncover the truth about Mom, aren't we?" Robert hugged his daughter. "Yes, my love. And we're going to make sure justice is served." As night gave way to dawn, the group prepared for the next chapter of their dangerous adventure. The truth was within their grasp, but the path to it was fraught with dangers and more secrets to uncover. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon when Robert, Eleanor, Sophie, and Lucy headed towards the outskirts of the city. Following Alexander's instructions, they were heading to an old abandoned factory, a place discreet enough for a clandestine meeting. "Are you sure we can trust him?" Robert asked Lucy as he drove cautiously. Lucy nodded. "Alexander is my brother. He may have been absent, but I know his intentions are good. He wanted to protect us all." Elena, seated in the passenger seat, constantly scanned their surroundings. "Still, we must be prepared for anything. We don't know who else might be watching." Sophie, from the back seat, watched as the landscape changed from urban to industrial. "Do you think Uncle Alexander has more information about Mom?" Robert looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror, his heart clenching at the mixture of hope and fear in the girl's eyes. "I hope so, sweetheart. I hope so." They finally arrived at the abandoned factory. The place seemed deserted, with broken windows and graffiti covering the exterior walls. Cautiously, the group approached the main entrance. "Wait here," Elena said, pulling out her gun. "I'll take a look first." But before she could advance, a voice resonated from the shadows. "That won't be necessary, Agent." A man slowly emerged from behind a column. He was tall, with dark hair sprinkled with grey, and several days' worth of stubble. His eyes, tired but alert, scanned the group before stopping on Lucy. "Little sister," he said with a small smile, "it's been a long time." Lucy ran to him, hugging him tightly. "Alexander, thank God you're okay." Robert stepped forward. "Mr. Alexander, we have a lot to talk about." Alexander nodded gravely. "Yes, Robert, more than you can imagine. But first, let's go inside." It's not safe to stay in the open. The group followed Alexander into the factory. In a small office in the back, he had set up a kind of improvised operations center with maps, photographs, and documents covering the walls. "I've been following this conspiracy for years," Alexander explained as everyone took a seat. Maria was the first to suspect that something wasn't right in the companies associated with Robert. When she came to me, I had no idea of the magnitude of what we were about to uncover. Elena intervened. "The files on the USB revealed a massive corruption network. What else do you know?" Alexander sighed heavily. "The network is even bigger than those files suggest. Politicians, judges, businessmen, they're all involved. Money laundering is just one part. There's also influence peddling, bribes, even murders." Robert felt his blood run cold. "Maria, was she murdered because of this?" Alexander nodded slowly. "Yes. She discovered something big, something that could have exposed the entire operation. I tried to warn her, to ask her to stay out of it, but she was determined to get to the bottom of the matter." Sophie, who had been listening in silence, spoke with a trembling voice. Who hurt my mum?" All the adults exchanged uncomfortable looks. Alexander knelt in front of Sophie, his voice soft but firm. "Sophie, your mother was a brave and just woman. She wanted to protect you and your father. The person responsible for her death is part of this criminal network, but I promise you, we'll do everything possible to bring them to justice." Robert hugged his daughter, fighting back his own tears. Eleanor, meanwhile, approached the maps and documents on the wall. "Alexander, what is all this?" she asked, pointing to a series of photographs connected with red threads. Alexander stood up and joined Eleanor in front of the wall. "This is the result of years of investigation. Each photo, each document, is a piece of the puzzle. But the center of it all, the brain behind this operation, is this man." He pointed to a photograph in the center of the map. Robert approached, his face paling as he recognized the image. "It can't be," he muttered. "It's George Reinhardt, my oldest partner, my best friend." Alexander nodded gravely. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, Robert, but George has been manipulating your companies for years for his own illegal purposes. Maria discovered it, and that cost her her life." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Robert sat down heavily, his world spinning. Eleanor put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "What do we do now?" Lucy asked, breaking the silence. Alexander went to a table in the corner and pulled out a folder. "I have a plan, but it's risky. With the information we have and what you brought on the USB, we can expose the entire network, but we need to act quickly and precisely." Eleanor took the folder and began to review it. "This is impressive. You've thought of everything." "Almost everything," Alexander corrected. "There's a final piece we need, and it's in George Reinhardt's safe. It's an accounting book that details all the illegal transactions of the last 10 years. Robert stood up, a new determination in his eyes. "I can get it. George trusts me. I can get into his office without raising suspicion." "It's too dangerous," Elena protested. "If George suspects something—" "I have to do it," Robert insisted. "For Maria, for Sophie, for everyone who has suffered because of this corruption, it's my responsibility." Alexander considered the proposal for a moment. "It could work, but we'll need a backup plan. Elena, can you contact your agency? We'll need official support when all of this comes to light." Elena nodded. "I'll do it, but I'll have to be careful. We don't know how far the corruption extends." Sophie, who had been listening to everything in silence, approached her father. "Dad, I'm scared. What if something goes wrong?" Robert knelt in front of his daughter, taking her small hands in his. "Sophie, my love, sometimes we have to face our fears to do the right thing. Your mother understood that, and now I understand it too. I promise you I'll do everything possible to come back to you safe and sound." Lucy approached and hugged Sophie. "Don't worry, little one. I'll be with you every moment. Your father and Elena are strong and brave, and my brother is the best detective I know. Everything will be all right." Alexander began to outline the details of the plan. Robert would enter George's office under the pretext of discussing a new business. Eleanor and Alexander would be nearby, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. Meanwhile, Lucy would stay with Sophie in a safe place. As the sun rose in the sky, the group prepared for the most dangerous mission of their lives. The truth was within their grasp, but the price could be very high. Robert looked at Elena, finding strength in her eyes. "Are you ready for this?" Elena nodded, taking his hand. Together until the end. With a final hug to Sophie, Robert and Elena left the factory, followed by Alexander. The fate of many depended on the success of their mission, and time was running out. As the group dispersed, none of them noticed the shadowy figure watching them from a distance, speaking quietly into a phone. "Mr. Reinhardt, we have a problem. Montgomery knows the truth, and he's coming for you." The Reinhardt Enterprises building loomed imposingly against the blue morning sky. Robert, dressed in his best suit, entered the lobby with a determined step, hiding the nerves that threatened to betray him. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery," greeted the receptionist with a smile. "Mr. Reinhardt is waiting for you in his office." Robert nodded, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Martha, I'll go up right away." As he rode the elevator, Robert mentally reviewed the plan. Get in, distract George, access the safe, obtain the accounting book. It sounded simple, but he knew anything could go wrong. On the street in front of the building, Elena and Alexander waited in a rented car, monitoring the situation through a hidden microphone in Robert's tie. "Do you think he'll be able to do it?" Elena asked, her voice tense with worry. Alexander kept his eyes fixed on the building's entrance. "Robert is smart, and George trusts him. If anyone can do it, it's him." Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, Lucy was trying to distract Sophie with board games, but the girl couldn't stop looking at the clock. "When will Dad be back?" Sophie asked for the umpteenth time. Lucy hugged her tightly. "Soon, honey. Your dad is very brave and will do everything possible to come back to you." Back at the Reinhardt building, Robert arrived at the top floor. He took a deep breath before entering George's luxurious office. "Robert, old friend," George exclaimed, standing up to greet him with a hug. "To what do I owe the pleasure of your visit?" Robert returned the hug, fighting against the nausea that contact with the man who had ordered Maria's death provoked in him. "George, I have a business proposal that you won't be able to refuse," Robert said, forcing enthusiasm into his voice. As Robert began to explain a fake expansion project, his mind worked at full speed, looking for an opportunity to access the hidden safe behind the painting he knew so well. In the car, Eleanor and Alexander listened attentively to the conversation. "He's doing a good job," Alexander murmured. "George seems to be taking the bait." But just when everything seemed to be going according to plan, the office door burst open. 3 armed men entered, pointing directly at Robert. "What is the meaning of this?" Robert demanded, feigning surprise. George slowly stood up, his face transforming into a mask of cold cruelty. "Oh, Robert. Did you really think I wouldn't know about your little investigation? You disappoint me, my friend." Robert's heart sank. They had fallen into a trap. In the car, Eleanor and Alexander looked at each other in horror. "Damn it!" Eleanor exclaimed, pulling out her gun. "We have to go in." "Wait," Alexander said, grabbing her arm. "If we go in now, they'll kill us all. We need a new plan." Inside the office, George approached Robert, who remained motionless, aware of the guns pointing at him. "You know, Robert, I always considered you like a brother," George said, his voice laden with false sadness. "Even when your dear Maria started sticking her nose where she shouldn't, I tried to protect you. But now you've gone too far." Robert looked him directly in the eyes, letting all his anger and pain reflect in his gaze. "You killed her, George. My wife, the mother of my child. How could you?" George shrugged indifferently. "Business is business, Robert. Maria became an obstacle, so I had to remove her. And now I'm afraid I'll have to do the same with you." At that moment, the sound of sirens filled the air. George frowned, moving closer to the window. "It seems we have unexpected company," he muttered. Robert took advantage of the momentary distraction. With a quick movement, he charged at George, knocking him down. The guards, surprised, took a second to react, time enough for Robert to reach the desk and press the alarm button. Chaos broke out in the office. The guards tried to subdue Robert, while George shouted orders. In the midst of the confusion, the door burst open again, this time revealing Eleanor and Alexander, guns in hand. Police! Everyone on the ground, Elena shouted, her voice resonating with authority. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of action. George tried to escape, but Alexander tackled him before he could reach the secret door behind the bookcase. The guards, outnumbered by the police reinforcements arriving, surrendered. When the dust settled, Robert found himself sitting in an ambulance on the street, being attended to by a paramedic. Elena approached, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, taking his hand. Robert nodded, still stunned by the events. "Yes, I'm fine." "George?" "In custody," Elena confirmed, "and we have the accounting book. Alexander found it in the safe while we were securing the scene." Robert let out a sigh of relief. "So is it over?" Eleanor smiled softly. "The dangerous part, yes. But there's still a lot to do. Unraveling this entire network will take time." "Dad?" Sophie's voice cut through the air. The girl ran towards them, followed closely by Lucy. Robert hugged his daughter tightly, tears finally flowing freely. "Sophie, my love, I'm here, I'm safe." As the family reunited, Alexander approached, his face serious but satisfied. "We did it, Robert. Maria would be proud." Robert looked around at this strange family that had formed in the midst of chaos and danger. Elena, the woman who had entered his life as a lie, but had become his greatest support. Alexander, the man who had risked everything for the truth. Lucy, loyal to the end. And Sophie, his brave daughter, the living reminder of Maria and everything they had fought for. "Yes," he finally said, a small smile forming on his lips. "We did it." But I feel like this is just the beginning. As the sirens continued to sound and reporters began to arrive at the scene, the group stood united, preparing for the long road ahead. The truth had come to light, but the consequences of that truth were just beginning to unfold. The days following George Reinhardt's fall were a whirlwind of activity. Newspaper headlines screamed about the scandal of the century, detailing the corruption network that extended to the highest levels of government and the business sector. Robert, Elena, Alexander, and Lucy found themselves at the center of a media storm. Statements, interviews, and meetings with prosecutors and federal agents seemed endless. In the midst of all this, Robert struggled to maintain normalcy for Sophie. One afternoon, while helping his daughter with homework, he received a call from Elena. "Robert, we need to talk," she said, her voice tense. "Can you come to headquarters?" When Robert arrived, he found not only Elena, but also Alexander and several federal agents. The expression on their faces told him something was wrong. "What's going on?" he asked, feeling his stomach churn. Elena took a deep breath before speaking. "We've been following the money trail, and—" "Robert, some of the transactions go through your companies of which you're the sole owner." Robert felt the ground move beneath his feet. "That's impossible." "I never—" Alexander intervened. "We know you weren't consciously involved, Robert, but the fact is that your signature is on several documents authorizing these transactions." "George," Robert muttered, the realization hitting him like a fist. "He must have forged my signature." Elena nodded. "That's most likely, but proving that will take time. Meanwhile, I'm a suspect," Robert completed, sinking into a nearby chair. "I can't believe it. After everything we've been through, after losing Maria." Eleanor knelt in front of him, taking his hands. "Robert, I promise you we'll do everything possible to prove your innocence, but we need you to fully cooperate with the investigation." Alexander added, "It will be difficult, friend. The media will go crazy when they find out about this, and your assets will probably be frozen during the investigation." Robert closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "What will I tell Sophie?" "The truth," Elena responded softly. "She's a smart girl. She'll understand that we're fighting to clear your name." The following days were a nightmare for Robert. As Alexander had predicted, the media turned against him. From a hero who had helped expose corruption, he became portrayed as a possible accomplice. Cameras harassed him every time he left the house, and headlines speculated about his guilt. Sophie, true to her nature, stood firm by her father's side. "I know you're innocent, Dad," she told him one night, hugging him tightly. "And we're going to prove it." Lucy also remained loyal, managing the house and protecting Sophie from the worst of the media scrutiny. "We'll get through this together," she assured Robert, "as a family." Meanwhile, Eleanor and Alexander worked tirelessly to find evidence that would exonerate Robert. They reviewed thousands of documents, interrogated dozens of witnesses, and followed every lead, no matter how small. It was during one of these long nights of investigation when Elena made a crucial discovery. "Alexander, look at this!" she exclaimed, pointing to a series of transactions on her screen. Alexander leaned over her shoulder, his eyes quickly scanning the numbers. This could be exactly what we need." The transactions showed a consistent pattern. Every time an illegal transfer was made using Robert's companies, there was a corresponding transfer to an offshore account in George Reinhardt's name. "It's as if he was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs," Elena murmured. "But why?" Alexander smiled grimly. "Insurance. George was always arrogant. He probably thought they'd never catch him, so he didn't bother to completely cover his tracks." With this new evidence, Eleanor and Alexander rushed to the prosecutor's office. After hours of meetings and deliberations, they finally obtained what they were looking for: an order to unfreeze Robert's assets and an official statement that he was considered a witness, not a suspect, in the ongoing investigation. When Elena arrived at Robert's house to give him the news, she found him sitting in the garden looking at the stars. Sophie was sleeping inside, exhausted after days of worry. "Robert," Elena called softly. He turned, and she could see the weariness in his eyes. "Elena, what are you doing here so late?" She sat down beside him, a smile lighting up her face. "We have good news. We found evidence that exonerates you. The prosecutor's office has withdrawn all suspicions against you." Robert looked at her, incredulous at first, then with a mixture of relief and gratitude that threatened to overflow. Without words, he pulled her into a tight embrace. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for believing in me, for fighting for me." Eleanor pulled away slightly, looking into his eyes. "Always, Robert. We're in this together, remember?" At that moment, under the starlight, with the weight of suspicion finally lifted from his shoulders, Robert realized something that perhaps he had known for a long time. He leaned in slowly, giving Elena time to pull back if she wanted, and kissed her softly. The kiss was sweet and full of promises, a new beginning amidst all the chaos they had faced. When they separated, both were smiling, a bit shy but happy. "We should go inside," Robert finally said. "I want to give Sophie the good news as soon as she wakes up." Eleanor nodded, intertwining her fingers with his as they walked towards the house. The road ahead would still be difficult. There were still many unanswered questions, many threads to unravel in the web of corruption they had uncovered. But for the first time in a long time, the future seemed bright and full of hope. As they entered the house, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from the darkness across the street. A figure holding a phone to their ear, whispering, "Sir, we have a problem. Montgomery has been exonerated, and it seems he and Agent Suarez have become close." The voice on the other end of the line responded with a grunt of frustration. "Very well. It's time to move to Plan B. Prepare everything. If we can't destroy Montgomery legally, we'll do it another way." The figure hung up the phone and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a silent threat hanging over Robert and Elena's newly found happiness.